What is a cult? Well, those are Google's first three definitions, provided by the Oxford English Dictionary, but it's a word that can be difficult to define, not least because, by some definitions, almost every religion qualifies as a cult. Yeah, don't worry, we're not opening up that can of worms now. How about I just give you a brief description of football, and you tell me whether you're getting any cult vibes? On a weekly basis, a congregation of hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of people gather in a collective place of worship, chant in unison, and tribally support their team, offering up their everlasting devotion and loyalty to an institution, and making enemies of all who oppose them. Does any of that sound suspicious to you at all? And if you think that a place of worship is me being hyperbolic or a mischaracterization at all, don't forget that football pitches are frequently referred to as being hallowed turf, at least here in Britain, and stadiums themselves frequently invoke religious language. Pelé called Wembley the Cathedral of Football, the San Mamés Stadium in Bilbao was referred to by locals as La Catedral, and AC Milan and Inter Milan have already announced that their new 60,000-seater stadium, which hasn't even started being built yet, will be named the Cathedral. Still not convinced? What else, other than something which startlingly resembles a cult, would cause people to defend behaviour as horrific as that committed by a number of footballers, most notably recently in relation to what I'd probably best call the allegations against Mason Greenwood, though I would imagine that most of you have seen the photographs and heard the audio, for no other reason than because they think that it would benefit the club that they have attached themselves to, or to defend one of the world's most brutal and barbaric regimes, as it tortures campaigners and critics into false confessions and beheads them, sometimes skipping the torture and confession part and just jumping straight to the old school assassination and dismembering of their corpse, because that same regime sanctioned not just the starvation of tens of thousands of Yemeni children, but also the signings of Sandro Tonali and Alexander Isak. Even the Branch Davidians only believed in the imminent second coming of Christ and the need to purify themselves for that coming. Thankfully though, Saudi-pilled Newcastle fans aren't stockpiling grenades and machine guns at a compound on Tyneside, or at least not as far as I'm aware. I don't suppose they'd inform me if they were. From the players themselves though, being contained within an insular environment, sometimes from as early as the age of 9, and unsurprisingly often self-destructing when they attempt to leave the sport, to fans excusing anything and everything in the name of what they think is best for their club, and often engaging in wild conspiracy theories relating to their rivals, and officials conspiring against them, with dangerous consequences for both themselves and others, football undeniably has some very cult-like tendencies. It is easy to boil football fandom down to mass congregations chanting in unison, or partisan disciples tolerating and venerating what they would otherwise find intolerable and denounce, but of course there is much more to football than just that. So how cult-like is the sport as a whole? Well, very helpfully, Cult Recovery 101, a support network for former cult members, has a 10-point checklist of cult characteristics, so let's see how well they map onto aspects of modern football. I am quoting every bullet point verbatim here, other than changing the word leader to club where necessary. Cult checklist point number 1. The group is focused on a living club to whom members seem to display excessively zealous, unquestioning commitment. Alright, so that one is pretty straightforward. Not all football fans, of course, a bit like not all men.
We're just normal men.
But a significant number could certainly be described as displaying excessively zealous, unquestioning commitment. I mean, why else would Chelsea fans, over 6 years after he stopped playing for them, not just admit that John Terry is a bit of a wrong'un? From mocking American tourists about 9/11 in the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers, to cheating on his wife in a 4-month affair with his teammate's ex-girlfriend, and being charged with racist and abusive language, Terry has a longer list of controversies listed on his Wikipedia page than Serbian war criminal Slobodan Milosevic. But then, Terry is a Chelsea legend. He played 717 games for the club, won 17 trophies, and captained the Blues with distinction for more than a decade. He was very good at playing football, and the fact that he was very good at playing football was very beneficial to Chelsea for 19 years. So any past, or indeed present indiscretions, are to be forgiven. I'm not picking on Chelsea here, just to be clear. At least here in England, I'm not sure that there is a single professional football club where this isn't the case for a large section of their fans. Liverpool, the fans, players, and the club themselves rallied around Luis Suarez after he was found guilty by an FA panel of having racially abused Patrice Evra. Who could forget the infamous t-shirts worn by every member of Liverpool's matchday squad for their game against Wigan Athletic? The defence of Suarez was always that the term that he admitted to using, in his native Uruguay, is not considered offensive. Of course, Suarez wasn't in Uruguay though, and Evra was a Frenchman playing in England. At best, that perhaps called for some leniency from the FA panel, not a full-blown campaign of support for someone who, in the country that he was living and playing football in at the time, had undeniably used what is considered to be a racist term. Even if you believe Suarez's defence in its entirety and thought that he deserved no punishment whatsoever as a result, rallying around someone in those circumstances, very publicly, as Liverpool did, rather than using it as a learning moment, for both Suarez, which you could argue Liverpool had a duty of care to do in the first place, if indeed his testimony was true, and others, is inexplicable. And we all know, in our heart of hearts, including even the most cult-like of Liverpool fans, that if instead of Luis Suarez, their star man, it had been someone like John Flanagan or Jay Spearing found guilty of using racist abuse, there is not a chance in hell that the club, players, or fans would have responded in the same way, or at least not to the same extent. Jamie Carragher apologised for supporting Suarez in 2019, stating that he felt uncomfortable at the time but lacked the courage to stand up for what was right. I'm not saying that many cult members probably have that feeling of knowing that something is wrong deep down but being too afraid to speak up and defy the groupthink of the in-group, but, well, no, that is exactly what I'm saying. The prominence of anti-racism campaigns in the intervening years since Suarez's ban might have made football clubs less likely to back even their best players in similar circumstances now, though perhaps due to image management more so than on any kind of moral grounds, but on other issues, it feels as though we have gone backwards. I don't actually think that 10 years ago, one of the world's biggest football clubs would entertain the idea and seemingly lean towards bringing back a footballer when the entire world and their dog had seen and heard the alleged evidence against them, as in the case of Mason Greenwood, and only renege on that reported decision because a leak of their own internal process led to such severe backlash. I find that hard to believe, and either way, it's incredibly concerning that it is the case now. A football club brainstorming which public figures and bodies were likely to support or oppose their decision to bring back Mason Greenwood, and concluding that domestic violence charities were likely to be hostile, is so egregious and undignified that it really beggars belief. Once again, had it been an academy player who Manchester United never expected to step up into the first team on modest wages, the idea that they would have moved heaven and earth to form what was still an incredibly flimsy defence of him is simply inconceivable. Even more worrying still, however, is the number of Manchester United fans with no economic skin in the game who are queuing up to defend Greenwood and champion his return with glee. At this point, it must be said that not all Manchester United fans, quite obviously, defended Greenwood or supported his return. In fact, I suspect that it was a significant, but nonetheless, very noisy minority online, many of whom just so happened to pay for Twitter Blue to make their dreadful views on everything even more prominent, and Manchester United have hundreds of millions of fans worldwide, so it's not particularly surprising that a large number of them are absolute dangers. It should also be noted that not everyone defending Greenwood and championing his potential return to Manchester United were even Manchester United fans. Some of them are just misogynists who have no issues with physical and sexual violence against women and will look to lock onto any such related causes. I don't think that is a football problem. It is a problem with all too many men and society as a whole. However, there are some people who aren't massive dangers in their everyday lives, and who might even consider themselves to be progressives, who just jettison those values, or at least park them to one side for a moment, as soon as their favourite football team is involved. Those are the types of people most likely to engage in light apologia. They don't deny the evidence, that would be absurd, but they will say things like, he was young, and there's nothing the club can do because she withdrew her involvement in the criminal prosecution. That's when fandom becomes dangerous. Awful people being awful with only a tangential link to football is one thing, but usually ordinary or reasonable people doing or saying awful things solely because of their football fandom is something quite different. The late Christopher Hitchens liked to say that, if you want to get good people to do wicked things, you need religion. But clearly, sometimes football, which would be the largest religious denomination of them all, can do the job just as well. The most interesting case of this is probably Newcastle United, since 80% of the club was acquired by the Saudi state through Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, controlled by Mohammed bin Salman. All of the same caveats apply. Not all Newcastle fans, there'll always be useful idiots, etc, etc. But I struggle to believe that, before the Saudi state acquired Newcastle, many Newcastle fans frequently found themselves online defending the arrest, torture and execution of minors, typically for engaging in some kind of pro-democracy campaigning or government criticism, sometimes when they are as young as 13 or 14, and swallowing hook, line and sinker press statements from the Saudi state, alleging that the people involved were all terrorists. Or that Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi journalist and critic of MBS, either deserved to be killed and his body be dismembered inside of the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, or, even more bizarrely, that he did it to himself with no Saudi involvement. And if you think that I am strawmanning anyone's argument there, not only do those people exist, you will find them en masse in my Twitter mentions and DMs. The most amusing one that I've seen, perhaps, is a handful of Newcastle fans angrily accusing Amnesty International of being bitter Sunderland fans or Mackhams for reporting on sports washing and human rights abuses in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. One of them even responded, and I'm not joking here, saying, I bet you didn't care about this sort of stuff before they bought Newcastle. They're Amnesty International. All they do is talk about human rights abuses. It is just so bizarre, but I think that it is indicative of a sort of cult-like insular mindset that the person who sent that tweet, and those like it, who presumably has no idea who Amnesty International are or what they do, cannot possibly conceive of why anyone might think murdering journalists, torturing minors into false confessions, or starving Yemeni children to death were bad things worthy of critique in of themselves, and that they therefore they just must be using it as a stick with which to beat Newcastle United. It is amusing in some ways, the idea that Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and Reprieve are all just secretly die-hard Sunderland-backed partisans, fueled solely by a hatred of Newcastle United, but it's also more than a little concerning that some people are that far gone. There are about a million more examples that I could list, but that is probably enough time dedicated to bullet point number 1 there. I promised to get through the other 9 in a lot less time than I spent on that one. Cult checklist bullet point number 2. The group is preoccupied with bringing in new members. Pretty straightforward one there. Football clubs go to great lengths to recruit new members. In fact, the entire business model of the Premier League is based upon the premise of bringing in new fans and increasing revenue as a result. Some clubs are even willing to sign players solely for the purpose of recruiting more supporters from a country or region where that player has a high profile and appeal. Dongfang Zhao, yes, I am looking at you, but not just you. Point number 2 is getting a big tick from me then, but in defence of football, I don't think that fans themselves often try to recruit new members. At least from personal experience, I don't really recall anyone ever trying to convince me to stop supporting Hull City and to start supporting another team instead. Maybe recruiting people who aren't already fans of the sport is more common, either to support a specific club or just to become more interested in football, but I don't think that is very harmful. Broadly speaking, I think football fans quite enjoy having friends who support rival clubs, and most of us would find it pretty tedious if everyone that we knew supported the same team, so on that front, not very cult-like. Well done, football fans, credit where it's due. Checklist number 3. The group is preoccupied with making money. Again, this is one where a separation of fans, clubs, and those actively involved in football is probably required. Football clubs are undoubtedly preoccupied with making money. Whether it be through broadcast rights, matchday revenue, or commercial deals, nothing is ever enough, and football has never been more monetized or commercialized, and fans have never been so squeezed for every penny that they have got. So that's certainly a big tick. Those who work in football are also extremely preoccupied with maximizing their earnings. The number of players willing to up sticks and go over to the Saudi Pro League for ungodly salaries is perhaps the most prescient example, foregoing previously expressed sentiments and morals in some instances, but players are far from alone. Agents, fairly or unfairly, and I would suggest that it depends upon the agent there, have come to epitomise greed within the game in a lot of fans' eyes. Football is remarkably cutthroat and money-oriented, so on that front too, it is a big fat tick. Though it should be said, it's hardly unique in that sense. Football clubs looking to maximise revenue and people who work in football looking to maximise their earnings are not especially cult-like, even if it ticks one of the bullet points, unless we are to accept that almost all companies and employees are cults, and that is another rabbit hole that I would really rather avoid. Fans themselves, of course, stand to gain little financially from their love of the game, quite the opposite in fact. Though, in this analogy, the clubs are the cults, and supporters are their loyal followers. And in most cults, it is not the members themselves who tend to be enriched, but the leaders and the organisations as a whole. So, on that front, the comparison actually holds up surprisingly well. Numero 4. Questioning, doubt and dissent are discouraged or even punished. Regrettably, it's another big fat yes on that one. We've already talked about how tribal football fans can be, and anyone who strays from that tribalism tends to be putting a target on their back. To use the Newcastle United example again, there is a group called NUFC Fans Against Sportswashing, which was formed when the takeover happened in October 2021, to represent fans who oppose the club being owned by the Saudi state, highlight Saudi human rights abuses, and lobby, insofar as they can, for a change of ownership. It would be fair to say that NUFC Fans Against Sportswashing only represent a minority of Newcastle United fans. As do, I would suggest, the fawning sycophants who have spent the last 2 years acting as a mouthpiece for the Saudi state. Most Newcastle United fans, from my experience at least, have a sort of detached attitude towards the whole thing. A kind of, well, there's nothing that I can do about it. I'm glad Ashley's gone. They're my team and I'm not just going to stop supporting them, and I'm still going to be glad when they do well. It is quite a defeatist attitude, and one which you wouldn't find at a club with as much history and tradition as Newcastle over in Germany, for example, but it's probably the prevailing view amongst Newcastle fans. Unfortunately, even from people who fall into that camp, NUFC Fans Against Sportswashing are chastised and derided, viewed as not really being Newcastle United fans, and, again, often accused of supporting Sunderland. It seems to me that you can either argue that the Saudi state and Newcastle are two separate entities, and although they own 80% of the club, Newcastle fans can't be expected to stop supporting their club because of that fact. Basically, the position there being that the club and the ownership are two distinct things. Or you can say that the two are inextricably tied now, and that support for Newcastle is at the very least tacit support for the Saudi state. If you believe that the two are entirely distinct, then you can't accuse someone of not being a proper or real Newcastle fan simply for criticising or opposing the ownership. That is only a coherent argument if you hold the view that Newcastle and Saudi Arabia are one and the same thing, which I don't think actually is a view that many Newcastle United fans hold. I don't want to focus on Newcastle or Saudi Arabia too much, and that is just perhaps the most extreme example, but across the board, questioning, doubt and dissent are discouraged. At Hull City, for example, the club that I support, Our current owner, Undeniably, has brought a feel-good factor back to the club, following the dark days of the Alams. Crowds are up, we have signed a few decent players, and the mood has markedly changed. I think that all of those things are good, what with, me being a Hull City fan and all, but controversially, I don't think that Undeniably is a messianic figure or the second coming of Christ. Maybe he will prove to be a good Hull City owner, Lord knows there haven't been many of them, or maybe he'll turn out to be terrible, like most of them. But the idea that a Turkish multimillionaire with no prior connection to the club cares as much about Hull City as the club's fans, beyond whatever personal, commercial, or financial interest convinced him to buy the club in the first place, is palpably absurd. I find fans celebrating commercial deals with random Turkish companies that might help us circumvent FFP, and this Turkish media mogul flying everywhere, multiple times a week by private jet, just a little bit odd. That's not really the part of football or of following Hull City that excites me, but if I were to express that view and degree of skepticism within a large enough group of Hull City fans, it's likely that it is me that would be the odd one out. The fifth bullet point, skipping one ahead in a similar vein, states, the leadership dictates sometimes in great detail how members should think, act and feel. Football fandom isn't that hierarchical like cults, it is typically more a case of groupthink, though I think that it is worth taking this opportunity to draw upon the cult-like aspects experienced by footballers themselves. Children are now brought into a formal football environment as young as the age of 9, in terms of being signed by academies, though some clubs have development groups that coach players who are even younger than that, and you can be pulled out of school from the age of 12. From that point on, pretty much, if you want to make it and don't possess truly one in hundreds of millions of levels of talent, you have to devote your life to the sport. Children, often encouraged by clubs and sometimes also their parents, become extremely single-minded. Things like education and normal human or childhood experiences are routinely sacrificed, and the regimen only becomes more extreme with the older that you get. Lots of footballers talk about, particularly during their teenage years and into their early 20s, essentially putting their life on hold. Whether that be leaving girlfriends, friendship groups, sacrificing nights out, family events, birthday parties, etc., all because their focus, they felt, and were often encouraged to feel, had to be entirely on football. Not to hammer the point home too much, and again, this isn't in any way exclusive to football, you find it in a fair few extremely competitive industries, but encouraging people to cut off existing relationships and parts of their lives, and demanding total loyalty and devotion, are obviously both things that are synonymous with cults. Spoiler alert, point number 10 reads, the leadership induces guilt feelings in members in order to control them. Members' subservience to the group causes them to cut ties with family and friends, and to give up personal goals and activities that were of interest before joining the group. Members are encouraged or required to live and or socialise only with other group members. Football fandom is often quite ritualistic, with fans having similar pre- and post-match routines each week, but for players, their lives are micromanaged to an extent that most people could barely imagine. They are told, typically from school age into their mid-30s, where to be, at what time, what to eat, what to drink, when to train, when to rest, and so on and so forth. Footballers are incredibly insular, and for obvious reasons. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that players find it so difficult and even traumatic to leave the sport, and to know what to do without that sense of community, routine, and direction, quite often with devastating consequences. It has been widely reported that Alex Ferguson liked his players to get married because it made them more stable and meant that he knew where they were, although I'm not sure the latter applied to Ryan Giggs. And it has also been reported that a high-profile current Premier League boss shares a similar sentiment and has encouraged his players to do likewise. Gordon Strachan once said of Sir Alex, quote, "He used to control your life." I am straying into an earlier bullet point here, since Alex Ferguson is basically sacrosanct within football, and even contemplating the idea of criticising him is tantamount to treason, but does that seem entirely healthy to you? Now, personally, if my boss started dictating that far beyond the realms of my work life, I would be out the door telling you all to subscribe to my second channel and setting up a Patreon to cover the mortgage before he'd even finished his sentence. But hey, maybe that's just me. Bullet point number 5, which I skipped earlier on, reads, mind-numbing techniques such as meditation, chanting, speaking in tongues, denunciation sessions, debilitating work routines are used to suppress doubts about the group and its leader. It doesn't get much more mind-numbing than that, and there are definitely some people who sit near me at Hull City who appear to be speaking in tongues most weeks. Either that, or it is just gibberish. Point number 7, the group is elitist, claiming a special exalted status for itself, its leader and members, might be a bit of a stretch. Though there are 1 or 2 fan bases that do their best. But point number 8, the group has a polarized us versus them mentality, which causes conflict with the wider society, couldn't really be much more fitting. I mean, what is the partisanship of supporting a specific football club, whether that be because of your birthplace, postcode, or familial links, if not a polarized us versus them mentality? The final bullet point that we haven't yet covered, bullet point number 9, I inadvertently covered in great depth at the beginning, or certainly the second half of it at least. It reads, the group's leader is not accountable to any authorities. The group teaches or implies that its supposedly exalted ends justify means that members would have considered unethical before joining the group. Yeah. Let's not go back over that one again, but football is perhaps as guilty of that as any other cult known to man. It's important to counteract all of this by noting that there are obviously many positive aspects to football, and indeed, to many things that are somewhat cult-like in some respects. Just because chanting in unison is a characteristic of a lot of cults doesn't mean that it is innately harmful or toxic, and the same goes for regiments, routines, and even the odd bit of tribalism. It is all a matter of extent. Football, when people have a healthy relationship with it, can provide an important sense of community, socialisation, organising and entertainment. With the demise of organised religion, though, certainly in this country and throughout much of the developed world, perhaps it is inevitable that people should latch onto something else and become overzealous in their commitment and devotion to it. Football can provide a sense of momentary joy and escapism in an increasingly atomised world and what sometimes appears to be quite an abject future. But instead of providing an escape, for many people, it just seems to become another form of entrapment. No one can convince me that someone who spends multiple hours of every day stanning either Messi or Ronaldo whilst deriding the other one and looking to diminish their talents is living a more happy or fulfilling life than they would be if they just took up gardening, pottery, or the consumption of narcotics instead. I am joking, of course. Who'd want to take up pottery? Humans yearn for a sense of identity and belonging, and football clubs are one of the few spaces that still provide that en masse. There are no entry requirements to support a football club. As soon as you pick a team, you are part of the in-group and one of us. Football can be primal, tribal, and often deeply illogical, but it can also be magical, mesmerising, and inspiring. In many ways, football is like a bridge of old and new worlds. It has the tribalism and primitivism of old, the gathering of otherwise often very different people in a shared space with a shared goal, at least for 90 minutes, and all of the mythology, traditions, and rituals associated with the sport. But it is also ruggedly capitalist now, stripped of so much of the meaning and authenticity that it once had, repackaged, and sold back to us as something quite different. As a sport, football, for all of its ills, is still often brilliant. As a religion, like a lot of religions some might suggest, it leaves a lot to be desired. Football isn't a full-blown cult, of course, or not yet at least, and supporting Wycombe Wanderers is unlikely to be as damaging in the short, medium, or long term as joining Jim Jones's People's Temple in Guyana was. but it has cult-like properties for both players and fans alike, which can be damaging and ought not be ignored, especially since those aspects have accelerated in recent years and only seem to be getting worse. Anyway, that is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, make sure to join the cult of Alfie Potsama by subscribing to both this channel and my second channel, Alfie Potsama, and turning on notifications. You can also find me on Twitter or Instagram via the username at HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so. There are links to everything down in the description below.